Picture this: gas stations across the Midwest with no fuel signs, grocery store shelves emptying of basic foods, nuclear power plants preparing to shut down. And all of this happening not because of a natural disaster, not because of a foreign invasion, but because of a single stroke of a pen in Washington, D.C. For decades, the United States operated under a dangerous assumption that Canada needed us more than we needed them, that our northern neighbor was simply an extension of American territory, a resource warehouse we could access whenever convenient. On January 25, 2026, that illusion shattered spectacularly, and what followed wasn't just a trade dispute. It was an economic earthquake that exposed the fragility of American power in ways that shocked even the most seasoned geopolitical analysts. This is the story of how the world's most powerful economy brought itself to its knees, and how Canada, the polite neighbor everyone underestimated, became the dealer holding all the cards. Let's rewind 48 hours. President Trump signed Executive Order 1299, imposing a blanket 25% tariff on all Canadian imports. Everything: energy, lumber, aluminum, minerals, the works. The strategy seemed straightforward: force Canada to renegotiate the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement on terms that would give America greater control over Canadian natural resources. The White House expected what had always happened before: polite negotiations, minor concessions, business as usual. They expected a delegation of Canadian officials to fly to Washington, hats in hand, begging for exemptions and waivers. That's not what happened. Instead, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, backed by a unified Canadian Parliament, did something unprecedented. He didn't impose counter tariffs. He didn't file a complaint with the World Trade Organization. He invoked the National Strategic Reserve Act. He didn't tax Canadian exports to the United States. He banned them entirely. Let that sink in. Canada didn't just make their resources more expensive for America. They cut off the supply completely. As I speak, valves on the Enbridge pipeline system are closing. Rail cars carrying critical fertilizers are stopping at the border. Uranium shipments destined for American nuclear power plants have been grounded. And the American economy isn't just feeling pain, it's experiencing a full-scale crisis. Gas prices in the Midwest jumped 80 cents overnight. The Chicago Board of Trade suspended trading on wheat futures because the panic over fertilizer shortages is so severe. The U.S. Department of Energy issued a red alert for the Texas power grid, not because of weather, but because refineries are starving for Canadian crude oil. This isn't a trade war. This is economic warfare. And for the first time in modern history, the United States is on the losing side. To understand why panic is spreading through Washington right now, you need to understand something most Americans don't know: the chemistry of oil. For the past decade, politicians have proudly declared that America is energy independent. We frack the Permian Basin in Texas. We pump millions of barrels of crude oil every day. We even export oil to other countries. So why does it matter if Canada cuts us off? Here's the dirty secret that shatters the energy independence myth: the mismatch. The oil coming out of Texas is called light sweet crude. It's thin, flows easily, and has low sulfur content. High-quality stuff. But here's the problem: the massive refineries along the Gulf Coast, the industrial facilities that turn crude oil into diesel, jet fuel, and gasoline, weren't built to process light, sweet crude. These refineries were constructed in the 1990s and 2000s with one purpose: to process heavy, sour crude. This is the thick, sludge-like oil that comes from Venezuela, Mexico, and crucially, Canada's oil sands. These refineries are like giant digestive systems specifically engineered to break down heavy crude. They've invested billions of dollars in specialized equipment, cokers and crackers, designed for this exact type of oil. If you feed these refineries only light Texas oil, they don't work efficiently. They run at 60% capacity. They can't produce enough diesel. They literally malfunction. For the past 5 years, since sanctions cut off Venezuelan supply and Mexican production declined, the U.S. refining system has had only one lifeline: Canadian oil sands. Canada sends nearly 4 million barrels of heavy crude south every single day. It flows through the Keystone Pipeline system, the Enbridge Mainline, and by rail. It is the blood flowing through the veins of America's industrial machine. When President Trump slapped tariffs on Canadian energy, he thought he was taxing a competitor. He was actually strangling his own supply chain. But Canada didn't just accept the tax. They played what I'm calling the China card. For years, the United States blocked pipeline projects like Keystone XL for environmental and political reasons. But there was an unspoken strategic benefit. It trapped Canadian oil in the North American market. If Canada couldn't ship its oil to coastal ports, they had to sell it to the United States at a discount. This is called the Western Canadian Select Discount, or WCS discount. It has saved American consumers billions of dollars every year on gasoline and diesel. But last year, something changed. The Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion finally opened, giving Canada direct access to the Pacific Ocean. Yesterday, Canada's energy minister announced a strategic partnership with Sinopec, the Chinese state oil giant. They've committed to purchasing every single barrel of heavy crude that the United States refuses to buy. Tankers are already lining up in Vancouver's port. So what happens now to the American Midwest? The Midwest, Petroleum District Number 2 in industry terms, relies on Canadian oil for 70% of its refinery feedstock. 70%. Without that oil, refineries in Illinois, Ohio, and Minnesota will have to shut down. You can't just redirect Texas oil northward overnight. The pipeline infrastructure doesn't exist in sufficient volume. The entire system was built assuming oil flows from north to south or from west to east. We're looking at a scenario where gas stations in Chicago, Detroit, and Minneapolis could run dry within 72 hours. Not just high prices, no gas at all. What about the Strategic Petroleum Reserve? It's mostly filled with medium sour crude. It can help, but it cannot replace 4 million barrels per day of specific heavy-grade oil. And even if it could, the SPR is located in Gulf Coast salt caverns, not the Midwest. The arrogance of, "we don't need Canada," ignored the physical reality of pipeline geography. We built a continent-wide energy machine assuming borders didn't matter. Now that the border has become a wall, the machine is breaking down. If you think the gasoline crisis is alarming, wait until we discuss electricity. The United States generates approximately 20% of its electricity from nuclear power. This is baseload power, the electricity that keeps your lights on when wind turbines aren't spinning and solar panels aren't generating. But here's a terrifying fact that few Americans understand. The United States produces almost zero uranium fuel. We import 95% of the uranium for our nuclear reactors. Where did we traditionally source it? Russia, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan. But in 2024, Congress banned Russian uranium imports as part of sanctions against Putin's regime. That left us with one reliable, secure, massive supplier: Canada. The Athabasca Basin in Saskatchewan is the Saudi Arabia of uranium. The Cigar Lake and McArthur River mines produce the highest-grade uranium deposits on Earth. Cameco, the Canadian uranium giant, keeps America's nuclear fleet running. When the trade war erupted, the White House assumed nuclear fuel would be exempt from retaliation. Critical infrastructure, right? Too important to politicize. They were wrong. In a move that reportedly shocked Pentagon officials, Ottawa designated uranium a critical national security asset. They've paused all export licenses to the United States pending what they're calling a comprehensive security review. This is checkmate in slow motion. Nuclear power plants operate on fuel cycles of 18 to 24 months. They don't stockpile years of inventory. Some American plants are scheduled for refueling this spring. If they don't receive their fuel bundles, they have to power down. If we lose 20% of our grid capacity right as summer approaches and air conditioning demand spikes, we're looking at rolling blackouts across the eastern seaboard. And unlike oil, you can't just buy uranium on the spot market and use it immediately. Uranium must be mined, milled, converted, enriched, and fabricated into fuel assemblies. The supply chain takes years to establish. Canada knows this. They understand that without their uranium yellowcake, U.S. Navy aircraft carriers can't operate their nuclear reactors. and the lights in Washington, D.C. could literally go dark. This is quiet leverage. Canada doesn't boast about military power, but they hold the keys to American defense infrastructure. The U.S. Department of Energy is currently scrambling to find alternative suppliers in Australia and Namibia. But the logistics aren't in place. The contracts don't exist. The enrichment facilities aren't scaled up. And guess who has been aggressively buying up African uranium supplies? China. By pushing Canada into a corner, we've created a scenario where they might sell this strategic asset to our geopolitical adversaries. Imagine Chinese nuclear reactors powered by premium Canadian uranium, while American reactors sit cold, all because of a dispute that started over lumber tariffs. It's strategic suicide. Energy keeps us moving. Uranium keeps our lights on. But this next commodity, this one keeps us alive. Let's talk about potash. It's a pink salt you've probably never thought about. But if you eat food, you depend on it completely. Potash is the K in NPK fertilizer: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. You cannot grow corn, soybeans, or wheat at industrial scales without it. Plants become weak, yields collapse, and food supplies vanish. The world has three main sources of potash: Russia and Belarus, both sanctioned, both unreliable. Canada, specifically Saskatchewan, and everyone else produces tiny amounts. Saskatchewan alone produces nearly 1/3 of the world's potash supply. But more importantly, it supplies 85% of the potash used by American farmers. 85%. We have no backup plan. There are no massive potash mines in Iowa. When Trump imposed the 25% tariff on all Canadian minerals, he effectively placed a 25% tax on every bushel of corn grown in America. But Canada didn't just let American farmers absorb the tax. They stopped the trains. The Premier of Saskatchewan, coordinating with the Prime Minister, cited supply chain instability and halted all rail shipments of potash heading south. We are now weeks away from spring planting season. Farmers across the Corn Belt are sitting on their tractors, staring at empty fertilizer barns. They need that potash now. If they don't apply it to their fields in April, there won't be a crop to harvest in October. If Canada keeps potash north of the border for just 30 days, American farmers miss the planting window entirely. Yields could drop by 30 to 40%. Do you understand what that does to food prices? Corn feeds cattle. Soybeans feed chickens. The price of beef, chicken, milk, eggs, and bread will double, possibly triple. Analysts are already calling this the breakfast tax, and it's entirely self-inflicted. We're already seeing futures markets spike. Some analysts predict a $15 Big Mac by July if this crisis isn't resolved. Meanwhile, Canada has a bumper crop season ahead. They have all the fertilizer they need. They can sell their surplus food to global markets at record prices, while American farmers face bankruptcy. The crushing irony? These tariffs were supposedly designed to protect American farmers from unfair competition. Instead, they're depriving American farmers of the one critical input they need to compete at all. For a century, the United States and Canada have operated like a married couple. We bicker and disagree, but ultimately we share the same bed. We're intertwined. The assumption in Washington has always been that Canada has nowhere else to go. They're geographically locked to the United States. They share our language and culture. They're trapped. That might have been true in 1990. It is absolutely not true in 2026. This morning, Canada's Trade Minister announced the Pacific Gateway Initiative. Ottawa is fast-tracking regulatory approvals for LNG, liquefied natural gas, terminals on the West Coast. They're accelerating critical mineral exports to Japan, South Korea, and yes, China. The Royal Bank of Canada released a report calling this the dependency trap exit strategy. Canadian policymakers have concluded that being 70% dependent on the United States for trade represents an unacceptable national security risk. They're willing to endure a short-term recession to break that dependence permanently. This is a nightmare scenario for the Pentagon. We rely on Canada for NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command. The radar stations that detect Russian missiles coming over the Arctic Circle sit on Canadian soil. We rely on Canadian aluminum to build F-35 fighter jets. Canada provides 70% of U.S. aluminum imports. We rely on Canadian steel for our tanks and armored vehicles. If Canada decides to adopt a neutral posture in this trade war, if they announce they'll trade equally with all nations, suddenly the U.S. defense industrial base has a gaping vulnerability. We can't build advanced fighter jets without their aluminum. We can't fuel our military vehicles without their oil. We can't detect incoming nuclear missiles without access to their territory. And the USMCA, the trade agreement that was supposed to bind us together, it's effectively dead, suspended. We've regressed to 1930s-style protectionism. But here's the critical difference. In the 1930s, the United States was largely self-sufficient. In 2026, the United States is a specialized, highly integrated economy that desperately needs raw materials. And we just declared economic war on our primary supplier. So how does this crisis resolve? It ends with a phone call. It ends with the President of the United States picking up the phone, calling Ottawa, and blinking, backing down, admitting defeat. Because the mathematics are undeniable. Yes, the United States can hurt Canada economically. We can crush their GDP. We can trigger a recession in Toronto and Vancouver. But Canada can stop our cars from running. They can starve our crops. They can turn off our lights. They can cripple our military production. The pain tolerance of a resource-rich nation is always higher than the pain tolerance of a consumption-rich nation. Canadians can burn wood to stay warm. They can eat their own wheat. They can power their homes with their own hydroelectricity. Americans cannot eat iPhones. We cannot fuel our cars with software. This trade war has brutally exposed the fragility of American economic power. We expanded our influence globally, but forgot to secure our own backyard. We treated our closest ally like a subordinate state. Now we're paying the price. The "we don't need Canada" movement was a bluff, and Canada just called it. As markets open Monday morning, keep your eyes on 3 key tickers: Cameco, CCJ, for uranium exposure; Nutrien, NTR, for potash and fertilizer markets; ExxonMobil, XOM, for refining margins and energy disruption. If those stocks are moving dramatically, the crisis is deepening. We'll likely see a temporary exemption announced by the White House within 48 to 72 hours. They'll frame it as a goodwill gesture or productive dialogue. But we'll know the truth. They looked at empty gas tanks in the Midwest. They saw food price projections. They got briefings on grid instability. And they realized that in 2026, geography still matters. We are stuck with each other. The map hasn't changed. The difference now is that Canada understands their leverage, and they're no longer afraid to use it. This crisis isn't just about trade policy or tariffs. It's about the fundamental structure of modern economies and the hubris of thinking any nation, even the most powerful, can go it alone in an interconnected world. For decades, America operated on the assumption that our economic might gave us unlimited negotiating power, that our military strength translated directly to economic invulnerability. Canada just taught us a very expensive lesson. Resource power beats consumer power. Geography beats ideology. And leverage only matters if you're willing to use it. The question now isn't whether the United States will back down. It's how much damage we'll sustain before we finally make that call to Ottawa. Thanks for watching. If this video opened your eyes to geopolitical dependencies you didn't know existed, hit that subscribe button. Because the ripple effects of this crisis are just beginning, and the next domino to fall might surprise you even more. The age of American economic dominance didn't end with a bang. It ended with a closed valve on a pipeline and an empty gas tank in Chicago. Welcome to the New World Order.